September 24, 1852, Paris, France. A man named Henri Giffard climbs into a gondola suspended beneath a 143-foot hydrogen-filled envelope, fires a 3-horsepower steam engine, and flies 17 miles from the Paris Hippodrome to the town of Elancourt. Controlled, powered, directed. 51 years before Kitty Hawk. That is not a myth. That is not speculation. It is documented by the French Academy of Sciences, celebrated in contemporary engineering journals, and preserved in the historical record with the casual certainty of something nobody thought to hide. Because in 1852, nobody yet realized it would need to be hidden. Before December 17, 1903, when 2 brothers in North Carolina are supposed to have invented the reason such ground would ever need to exist. The Wright brothers flew 120 feet in 12 seconds at Kitty Hawk. That is the official beginning of human flight. Everything before it, according to the textbooks, was earthbound: horse, rail, ship, foot. But Henri Giffard flew in 1852. Clement Ader achieved powered flight in a steam-driven aircraft in 1890. Thousands of Americans reported a structured aerial craft crossing 19 states in 1896 and 1897. And the maps, the old city plans that nobody reads anymore, show infrastructure built for something that moves through the air. Infrastructure that was already old when the Wright brothers were born. If this is your first time here, subscribe to this channel. This is where we investigate the parts of history that were quietly removed from the record. The erased timelines, the buried infrastructure, the evidence hiding in plain sight. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I want to know how far this reaches. The maps don't lie the way words can lie. A cartographer in the 18th or 19th century staked his reputation, sometimes his livelihood, on accuracy. Merchants depended on these documents. Governments commissioned them. Military planners used them to position fortifications and plan supply routes. Every road, every waterway, every property line had to be precise, because real decisions were made on the basis of what the map showed. So when those same maps show long, flat, uniform strips of cleared ground with no label, no purpose, and no connection to the road network, the absence of explanation is itself significant. These were not surveying errors. They were not decorative. They were drawn with the same care and precision as everything else on the page, which means the cartographer saw them, measured them, and recorded them as existing features of the landscape. The dimensions are consistent across geographies, widths ranging from 100 to 300 feet, lengths extending 2,000 to 5,000 feet. Surfaces graded flat in an era when grading land at that scale required significant labor and engineering investment. Positioned adjacent to government buildings, administrative centers, and military installations, not in agricultural fields, not in residential districts, but in the functional heart of civic infrastructure. For comparison, a modern general aviation runway requires a minimum width of 60 feet and a minimum length of roughly 2,500 feet. The strips on these 18th and 19th century maps fall comfortably within those parameters and in many cases exceed them. The official explanation, where one exists at all, categorizes them as parade grounds, military exercise fields, or public promenades. And perhaps some of them served those purposes at some point. But parade grounds don't require wind-aligned orientation. Exercise fields don't need to be graded to airstrip level flatness. And promenades don't appear on maps as featureless, unlabeled strips, positioned at the edges of cities with no pedestrian infrastructure connecting them to the urban fabric. The infrastructure is there. The explanation is not. In 1791, Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, a French-born engineer, submitted his plan for the new American capital, Washington, D.C. The design features broad diagonal avenues cutting across a rectangular grid, creating a pattern of radiating lines that converge on central monuments and government buildings. From the ground, these diagonals create awkward intersections, wasted triangular lots, and confusing navigation. From the air, they form a precise geometric star. In Paris, between 1853 and 1870, Baron Georges Eugene Haussmann carved enormous straight boulevards through the medieval city under orders from Napoleon III. The official justification includes sanitation, troop movement, and fire prevention. The boulevards are ruler straight, some extending for miles, averaging 100 feet in width, lined with uniform buildings of identical height. From street level, they are impressive. From above, they form a radial network of convergent sight lines of mathematical precision. St. Petersburg, Buenos Aires, New Delhi, Melbourne. The same pattern repeats. Massive straight thoroughfares, far wider than horse-drawn traffic demanded, far straighter than terrain dictated, far more geometrically precise than ground-level planning would produce. Every one of these cities was planned or redesigned during the 18th or 19th century. Every one features boulevard systems whose logic only fully reveals itself from an aerial perspective. The standard explanation treats this as coincidence, shared aesthetic values, the influence of classical Roman urban planning, the desire for monumental grandeur. But classical Rome didn't build ruler straight, wind-aligned corridors 5,000 feet long and 200 feet wide. Classical Rome built roads that followed terrain and connected destinations. These boulevards do something different. They create unobstructed, flat, straight corridors through dense urban environments, oriented not toward destinations, but toward wind patterns and geometric centers visible only from altitude. Who designed cities to be seen from above in an era when no one was supposed to be looking down? In 1858, Gaspard Félix Tourneau, the French photographer known as Nadar, ascended 1,600 feet above the village of Petit-Bicêtre in a tethered hot air balloon and took the first known aerial photograph. The image itself has been lost, but its existence is documented beyond dispute. 2 years later, in 1860, James Wallace Black photographed Boston from a balloon called the Queen of the Air at roughly 2,000 feet. That photograph survives. It resides in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It shows rooftops, streets, and the geometric layout of a city from directly above. Balloon flight had been established since 1783, when the Montgolfier brothers ascended over Paris. By the 1850s, manned balloon flights were routine enough for military reconnaissance, scientific observation, and aerial photography. The perspective from above was not theoretical. It was operational, documented, published, available to anyone with access to a balloon and a clear day. This means that when L'Enfant designed Washington in 1791, the technology to view cities from above was 8 years old. When Haussmann redesigned Paris in the 1850s, aerial photography was being developed simultaneously. The geometric patterns in these city plans were not designed for a perspective that didn't exist. They were designed for a perspective that was increasingly, demonstrably available. But here's what the standard narrative omits. If balloon technology was mature enough by the 1850s for photography and powered dirigible flight was achieved by 1852, then the infrastructure to support aerial movement, landing areas, mooring points, navigation references would have been a logical, even necessary development. Lighter than aircraft need landing zones. They need mooring infrastructure. They need clear, flat, unobstructed ground for approach and departure. And they need it positioned in proximity to the administrative and governmental centers they serve. The strips on the old maps suddenly stop being anomalies. They start being answers. The Empire State Building, completed in 1931, was explicitly designed with a mooring mast for dirigible airships. This is not alternative history. It is architectural fact, documented in the building's original promotional materials. Al Smith, the building's chief promoter, publicly announced that passengers would disembark from airships via gangplank at the 102nd floor. The structural engineering of the Crown was calculated to withstand the lateral forces of a tethered airship in wind. In September 1931, a privately owned dirigible docked at the mast for approximately 3 minutes. The concept is presented as a forward-looking 1930s innovation. A bold idea ahead of its time. Except the structural elements of the Empire State Building's mooring system, reinforced rooftop platforms, anchor points, wind load calculations, elevated docking infrastructure appear on government buildings and civic structures dating back over a century earlier. Across Europe and North America, 18th and 19th century administrative buildings feature rooftop elements that architectural historians classify as towers, cupolas, observation decks, or decorative spires. The classifications are familiar. The engineering specifications behind them are not. Many of these structures are reinforced far beyond what decoration or observation would require. They feature metal anchor points with no documented ceremonial purpose. They include elevated platforms accessible by internal staircases that lead to rooftop areas with no apparent function. In isolation, each structure has a plausible conventional explanation. Taken together, across dozens of cities, across 2 centuries, following identical structural principles, the pattern suggests infrastructure designed for a specific purpose that was either abandoned or reclassified when the narrative of aviation was rewritten to begin in 1903. Between November 1896 and May 1897, newspapers across the United States published hundreds of reports describing a mysterious aerial craft observed over 19 states. The Sacramento Evening Bee, the Chicago Tribune, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, the Milwaukee Sentinel, paper after paper in city after city carried accounts from witnesses who described a structured vessel with lights, propellers, and controlled movement. The descriptions share remarkable consistency. A cigar-shaped body, bright electric lights, sometimes colored, a mechanical hum or engine noise, controlled directional flight, not drifting with wind but moving against it. The witnesses included farmers, merchants, police officers, newspaper editors, and in several cases, groups of dozens observing simultaneously. The official explanation invokes mass hysteria, misidentified planets, and newspaper circulation wars. Some sightings were undoubtedly hoaxes. The 1890s press was not above sensationalism. But the geographic spread, the consistency of description, and the sheer volume of independent reports across thousands of miles in 5 months resist dismissal as collective delusion. 6 years before Kitty Hawk. In an era when the patent offices were already processing hundreds of applications for airship technology. In a decade when lighter-than-air craft had been operational for over 40 years. In the same period when those unlabeled strips appear on city plans across the country. The sighting stopped in May 1897. The newspaper reports ceased. The phenomenon entered folklore and was quietly absorbed into the category of curiosity. And 6 years later, 2 bicycle mechanics in North Carolina became the official inventors of flight. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago covered over 600 acres of Jackson Park. Its buildings were massive neoclassical structures arranged along waterways and boulevards of extraordinary width. The aerial bird's eye illustrations commissioned for the fair reveal the layout in its entirety, and the pattern is striking. Long, straight, wide corridors, open plazas of unusual dimensions, flat expanses of ground far larger than pedestrian circulation would require. Tethered balloon rides were documented attractions at multiple World's Fairs. Aerial demonstrations were discussed in contemporary engineering journals. Patent applications for dirigibles and propulsion systems cluster around fair dates. The fairgrounds themselves, with their wide corridors and open sight lines, match the specifications of the unlabeled strips appearing on city plans from the same era. And then the buildings were demolished. The White City, which contemporary observers called one of the greatest architectural achievements in American history, was burned and dismantled within months of the fair's close. Temporary, they said. Exhibition purposes only. The same explanation accompanies the destruction of exposition buildings in Paris, in London, in St. Louis. Magnificent structures, engineered with permanent precision, destroyed on schedule as if their continued existence posed some unspoken problem. What the fairgrounds looked like from above, what their wide corridors and flat expanses and geometric layouts were actually designed to accommodate, is a question that the demolition conveniently made much harder to answer. The patent offices of the 19th century contain hundreds of applications for lighter-than-air craft, propulsion systems, navigation instruments, gas production methods, and mooring mechanisms. These are not speculative sketches. They are detailed engineering documents with material specifications, performance calculations, and operational parameters filed by qualified engineers and funded, in many cases, by government agencies. Henri Giffard's 1852 dirigible existed within an ecosystem of aerial development spanning decades. Dupuy de Lôme built a navigable balloon for the French military in 1872. Charles Renard and Arthur Krebs flew a fully controllable electric-powered airship in 1884, completing a closed circuit over Chalet Moudon. David Schwartz tested an aluminum-skinned rigid airship in 1897. Ferdinand von Zeppelin launched his first airship in 1900, 3 years before Kitty Hawk. And on the ground, Charles Frederick Page, a timber contractor from Louisiana, designed and patented a full-scale airship, sending it to the 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis. His patent was granted in 1906. His name appears in almost no mainstream aviation history. This isn't a handful of dreamers. This is an entire industrial and engineering sector that was actively developing aerial technology throughout the second half of the 19th century. The infrastructure to support it, the landing areas, the mooring points, the manufacturing facilities, the supply chains for hydrogen gas and lightweight materials, all of this would have existed in parallel. It would have left traces. Physical, measurable, mappable traces. Traces that look exactly like what appears on those old city plans. After 1903, the Wright Brothers became the origin story. The prior century of development was compressed into a brief preamble, a few paragraphs about early experiments that supposedly led nowhere until Kitty Hawk. The infrastructure was relabeled, the patents were filed away, and the strips on the maps became parade grounds. Henri Giffard flew a powered airship in 1852. Clement Ader achieved powered heavier-than-air flight in 1890. Nadar photographed cities from the air in 1858. Thousands of Americans observed a structured aerial craft in 1896. City plans from the 1700s show unlabeled flat strips matching airfield specifications. Government buildings from the same era feature unexplained rooftop mooring infrastructure. Patent offices contain decades of aerial technology applications, predating Kitty Hawk by half a century. And the official history of human flight begins on December 17, 1903. The narrative doesn't simplify history, it amputates it. It removes an entire century of documented aerial development, documented infrastructure, documented engineering achievement, and replaces it with a single moment. Two brothers, 12 seconds, as if everything before was merely dreaming. But infrastructure doesn't dream. Graded earth doesn't speculate. Reinforced rooftop platforms don't imagine. Patent applications don't fantasize. They document what existed. And what existed, according to the physical evidence still embedded in the cities we walk through daily, was a world that moved through the air long before we were told it was possible. The strips are still there on the old maps. The rooftop anchors are still bolted into place. The patent records are still filed. The photographs from the 1850s still show cities from above. The boulevards are still straight, still wide, still aligned with winds that have no relevance to horse-drawn traffic. Tell me where you're listening from. Tell me if you've seen these strips on old maps of your city, if the buildings near you have rooftop structures that nobody has ever explained. This channel is becoming more than an investigation. It's becoming a community of people who look at the evidence sitting in plain sight and refuse to accept that every question has been answered. You're part of this now. And the more of us who start looking at old maps, old buildings, old skylines, the harder it becomes to maintain the story that nothing was in the air before Kitty Hawk. The runways remember. The rooftops remember. The maps remember. Even if the history books have chosen to forget.